I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Most of us take breathing for granted, but we're surrounded by an entire ecology of invisible microbes. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
You've heard about the microbiome, the collection of bacteria, viruses, and fungi living in our digestive tracts, brains, and skin. There's also a microbiome in our lungs.
The air we breathe is not sterile. It's full of microbes. Some are beneficial and some are highly dangerous. From COVID to TB, we get sick because we inhale viruses and bacteria.
What should you know about the aerobiome that surrounds us?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the hidden dangers in the air we breathe.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, cancer researchers are now recommending exercise as a way to delay or prevent recurrence. Observational studies have long suggested that physical activity could benefit cancer patients. Now, an international group of scientists has completed a multi-site randomized trial confirming this effect. The 889 patients had undergone surgery and chemotherapy for colon cancer. The investigators assigned 445 of them to regular exercise with coaching by a personal trainer for 3 years. They allotted 444 patients to health education as a control group. After 5 years, 80% of those in the exercise group were alive and well. In comparison, disease-free survival was just under 74% for those in the control group. These results are even better than those for some anti-cancer drugs. They will likely shift patients' and doctors' perception of exercise from something that's nice to do to something that could save your life.
We may have been underestimating the value of physical activity. A team of scientists analyzed the activity of more than 200 adults between 45 and 60 years old. Over the course of 9 days, these volunteers reported 5 times a day what physical activity they had completed in the previous 3.5 hours. Then they took 2 cognitive tests to measure processing speed and working memory. Dramatically, the results on the cognitive test showed people's processing speed was much faster when they had been active before their check-in. The gain was equivalent to being 4 years younger. That held up whether the activity was light, like walking or vacuuming, or whether people had been running or cycling.
For many, a morning cup of coffee seems like a necessary start for the day. But a new study presented at the American Society for Nutrition suggests that there are longer-lasting benefits. More than 47,000 women were tracked through the Nurses' Health Study starting in 1976. These volunteers were queried about things like coffee, tea, soft drinks, and health outcomes such as diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and heart disease. Those who drank the most coffee between the ages of 45 and 60 were healthier than those who drank less than a cup of coffee a day. The high end of consumption was nearly 7 8-ounce cups daily. Women who drank tea or decaffeinated coffee did not achieve these benefits. This is not the first time that scientists have found benefits from coffee drinking. A recent study published in the European Journal of Nutrition reported that coffee drinkers were less likely to become frail. The UK Biobank study of almost 500,000 people also indicates healthy aging benefits for coffee drinkers.
Drinking sugar-sweetened beverages appears to increase the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes, according to a recent meta-analysis. The analysis of 29 studies found that sugar in liquid form was more hazardous than that in fruit or other solid foods. Each additional serving of sugary drink daily increased the risk of diabetes by 25%. Fruit juice consumption bumped the risk by 5% per serving. Solid foods slow the absorption and metabolism of sugar.
More than 40 million Americans take antidepressant medications. For years, doctors did not warn patients that stopping such meds could precipitate unpleasant withdrawal symptoms. A new study published in Epidemiology and Psychiatric Sciences reviewed the medical literature. Only 7 studies met the selection criteria on post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Symptoms included insomnia, dizziness, nausea, anxiety, panic, agitation, fatigue, and disequilibrium. The researchers report that the duration of withdrawal symptoms varied enormously, from several months to many years. The investigators bemoan the lack of high-quality research on this topic and call for more rigorous investigation. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Most of us take the air we breathe for granted, whether we're in a supermarket, a restaurant, or a forest. The idea that we're inhaling microorganisms with every breath seems kind of strange.
And yet we're surrounded by microorganisms in the aerobiome. How does that affect our health? Most Americans hate the idea of wearing masks to protect themselves from airborne infection. There are times, however, when it makes sense. No one would want a surgical team to operate without masking up beforehand. What should we have learned from Florence Nightingale over 170 years ago?
To learn more about aerobiology, we turn to Carl Zimmer. He writes the Origins column for the New York Times. Carl Zimmer is an adjunct professor at Yale, where he teaches writing. He's the author of 14 books about science, including Life's Edge. His most recent book is Airborne: The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Carl Zimmer.
Thanks for having me.
Carl, we have been writing about the microbiome of the digestive tract for, I guess, about 15 or 20 years. And I think more recently there is a recognition that there is a microbiome of our skin, our brain, even in our lungs and other parts of our body. But we're just beginning to grasp this concept of the aerobiome. What the heck is the aerobiome?
Well, the aerobiome is everything that's alive in the air. And that can be a bird, it can be a dragonfly, but it also includes lots of things that are too small to see with the naked eye, including bacteria and viruses and fungal spores. And the fact is that these microscopic life forms are floating around us in incredible numbers. Just the numbers are almost hard to even think about. And this habitat, I think of the atmosphere as a habitat, it goes from the ground, up perhaps 40 miles into the stratosphere, and you can find life throughout. And this is a habitat that we actually, we walk through and we breathe. We breathe a couple thousand gallons of air a day, and we are breathing living things along the way.
I'm assuming when you start talking about how high this potentially alive area is, that is sort of like the ocean, that you have different types of organisms at different levels. Is that true?
Well, it's interesting to compare the atmosphere to the ocean. I mean, in a way, the aerobiome, it's kind of like an ocean of gas. And there are different species that can sort of get up to different heights. I mean, we can jump and get a few feet off the ground, and then we fall back down. But if you are a moss spore, for example, and you're released from your parent moss plant, if the winds kick up, you can fly up miles into the sky and then travel for hundreds or even thousands of miles. And so, how high you can get in the atmosphere does depend on a lot of different things. It depends on how easy it is for you to be lifted up. And it also depends on how well you're going to be able to resist the challenges of being up there. A very dry environment. And if you get into the stratosphere, then you're facing unbelievable amounts of ultraviolet radiation and cosmic rays and so on. But there are things that are able to get up there and survive and come back down.
Now, centuries ago, the early Greek healers thought that air was important in terms of health. And, we get the word miasma from this concept that bad air would make you sick. But that idea really fell off. Can you tell us why we dropped this concept as a silly superstition?
Yeah, so Hippocrates would describe a lot of different particular diseases as being caused by different kinds of corruptions of the air. There's something went bad about the air itself, and if you inhaled that, then that could disrupt your humors. And this could help to explain why it was that a bunch of people in a village would all get the plague at once, even though they were young and old and ate different things and so on. If they all breathe the same air, that could explain it. That's not how plague spreads. Plague is caused by bacteria that are carried by fleas, and often those fleas are being transported on rats. The miasma sort of paradigm lasted for an incredibly long time. It lasted from maybe 2,500 years ago right up until the late 1800s. So at that point, the architects of the germ theory disease, they said, no, it's not miasmas. It's actually microorganisms that are causing a lot of these diseases like plague or cholera. Not only that, but they were finding that they were not present in the air, but present in a flea, or in the case of cholera, present in contaminated water. They were not seeing a lot of evidence that there were disease-causing organisms in the air, and so they said, like, well, let's just forget the air. Essentially by the early 1900s, public health authorities considered the air basically harmless when it came to infectious disease.
What I find fascinating, Carl, is that Florence Nightingale, who kind of the mother of modern nursing, recognized that air was important back in the 1800s. She was in the Crimea, and she was helping deal with a lot of very sick and wounded soldiers. And she said, "Open the windows. We need fresh air in here." And she wrote about it, but that seemingly good advice has been ignored now for a couple of 100 years.
Yeah, and the case of Florence Nightingale is really fascinating. I mean, she is an incredibly important figure in the history of medicine, and it had a long-term effect. I mean, she literally changed the way that hospitals were designed, just their architecture. Changed because of her quest to make sure that people were getting fresh air. She would have hospitals built with long hallways and with rooms coming off of them in a way that would promote ventilation. That was a good idea, but for the most part, Florence Nightingale worked in a sort of pre-germ theory paradigm. She believed essentially in miasmas, and which is not true. So it's just one example of how, in the history of medicine and science, you can be right and wrong at the same time. These things are mingled together, and so we should be careful not to sort of turn people into sort of simple heroes to serve our purposes today. They were products of their time.
Well, as you've just been describing the aerobiome, you've said, birds and insects and all sorts of things might be part of the aerobiome, but also all that invisible stuff, which, as you say it, seems kind of obvious. Viruses, bacteria, um, fungal spores, all sorts of things like that float around and get to wherever it is they're going by floating on the air. And yet we ignored that for a long time. Because you've said it, it seems, oh, of course. But until you say it, people aren't thinking about it. Has it been a problem of it was difficult to measure those things, or there were some other reason we weren't looking for them?
It is very challenging to study life in the air. There's no question about that. Partly because the atmosphere is so vast and because a lot of the things that float around in it are so small. And, Louis Pasteur actually was one of the first people to really make a strong case that there were what, as he called, floating germs. And he made this case in the late 1850s. And one journalist said, you want to lead us into a world that is too fantastic to believe. So I do think that there is something like fundamentally weird and hard to accept about the idea that there are trillions of organisms that get into the air and float around us, and are millions of species. You look up and you see a cloud that there are thousands of species of microbes floating in that cloud. That's a hard thing to accept, and the to study them is very challenging because they can be, how are you going to track fungi that are a couple miles over your head? Like this is hard stuff, and it's really only been in recent years actually that some of the most powerful technology has enabled a real survey of the aerobiome.
We're going to talk a little bit about spores and mold because there are a lot of people who complain that they are, quote unquote, either allergic or they're being made sick from spores and mold. And they can tell when they walk into a building that there's a real problem. And yet a lot of health professionals go, oh, it's all in their head. They're making that up. That's crazy. We just have a few seconds before we need to take a break. But when we come back, I would like you to tell us about COVID, because it seems to me as if this coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, in the early going of the pandemic, a lot of public health officials and infectious disease experts really got it wrong. So when we come back from the break, we'd like you to tell us why we messed up so badly.
You're listening to Carl Zimmer, an award-winning science journalist. He writes the Origins column for the New York Times and is the author of the recently released book, Airborne, The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe.
It's time for a short break. At the start of the COVID pandemic, the messages were all about social distancing by 6 feet, as well as disinfecting. How did we get it so wrong?
There's been skepticism about airborne infections, but COVID showed us it's real.
Measles and TB can both be spread through the air. Should we be paying more attention?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Today we're talking about the air we breathe and all the invisible microorganisms that we inhale with every breath. What is the impact of this aerobiome on our health?
Many people dismiss the significance of airborne infection. We've heard from readers and listeners that all one needs is a healthy immune system. Is that really adequate protection against highly contagious airborne pathogens?
Long ago, tuberculosis was called the White Death. It's a highly contagious disease, and over 1 million people die each year around the world from this easily transmitted respiratory infection. Measles is another serious infection that spreads easily through the air. Even norovirus, which causes devastating diarrhea and vomiting, can be transmitted through the air.
To learn more about airborne infections, we're talking with Carl Zimmer. He writes the Origins column for the New York Times. He teaches writing as an adjunct professor at Yale University and is the author of 14 science books. His most recent is Airborne: The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe.
Carl, I think that some of the impetus, perhaps, for your wonderful book, Airborne, came from the COVID pandemic when all of us started paying a bit more attention to what might be in the air we're breathing. I believe that when the pandemic started, we got very conflicting messages from public health authorities. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, when COVID started, I mean, I think a lot of us might remember wiping down our groceries. I certainly do.
Yeah.
And the thinking there was that COVID might be spread when, people sort of wiped their nose on their hands and then started handling surfaces, bags and what have you, and they would contaminate with the virus, or maybe they cough on it. And so that would be a dangerous route of transmission. And turns out that was not true. There were a small number of scientists who said, we need to take seriously the possibility that COVID is airborne. In other words, it spreads from sick people from their breath like smoke in these tiny droplets.
They got a lot of pushback.
Yes. The World Health Organization very explicitly said COVID is not airborne in March 2020. And there were other ways in which, governmental public health agencies pushed back and did not want to deal with that possibility. And that turns out to be a mistake. The consensus is indeed that COVID is quite airborne, like a lot of other diseases are. And that fascinated me. How did that happen? And when I would talk to scientists about that conflict, they'd say, well, this is not new. This conflict has a deep history about in terms of accepting or denying the possibility of airborne infection.
Can you tell us anything about that deep history?
Sure, yeah. So in the early 1900s, when the germ theory of disease really became triumphant, people really took their eye off of the air. And there were just a very, very few people at the time who championed this view, and they are mostly forgotten by history. So, for example, William and Mildred Wells were these husband and wife scientists who worked at Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, and they did a lot of work in the 1930s just establishing the basics that, yes, indeed, this is how diseases can spread through the air. And in fact, they even figured out that they could disinfect the air to kill off influenza viruses and measles viruses and other things, and even protect people from outbreaks. They worked all that out in the 1930s, but then that was, largely rejected and forgotten, unfortunately.
Well, Carl, I think people would be really interested in how you disinfect the air, and why in the world would we be ignoring that now?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways, a lot of different strategies one can use to keep the air healthy. The very simplest one is, if the weather's okay, just open a window. You will get fresh air ventilating in. And so if someone has been exhaling a lot of pathogens into the air, that fresh air is going to dilute that, and it's going to become much safer for people inside. Air purifiers can work. Certain ultraviolet lamps can be effective in certain situations. There are a lot of strategies, but I would say even now, even after our experience with COVID, there's not that much recognition of this important way to improve our health. There are no mandates for indoor air quality for infectious disease.
Well, I want to come back to that issue in a bit, but I want to go back to COVID. And in particular, because we had the opportunity to interview some air quality experts, and they were all talking about, as you mentioned, smoke. If somebody's smoking a cigarette or a cigar and you walk into that room, you are breathing those particles. And boy, most public health officials and infectious disease experts just didn't buy it. Can you tell us a bit about is it pronounced Skagit Valley Chorale, and why that was such an important moment?
Yeah, so the Skagit Valley Chorale is a singing group in Washington State. And they were just minding their own business, rehearsing for a concert in March 2020. They knew that that COVID was a concern, but they were following the guidelines that the Center for Disease Control were putting forward. So people who were sick didn't come to rehearsal. No one seemed to be showing any symptoms. They were washing their hands carefully and doing things of that nature. But they thought that it was okay for them to then, rehearse a concert. So they were singing together. And what seems to have happened is that one person came in and nobody knew it, but she had COVID, and she was there for about an hour, and she infected almost 60 other people just in one shot. And it was a really terrible experience for the chorale. Two of their members died. A lot of them were going through this terrible illness. But it turned out to be a kind of a test case for understanding how COVID spreads, because a number of scientists published a study on that experience. And they said, we can't really figure out any other way for this virus to have gotten to so many people across such long distances, except that it was airborne. It was a poorly ventilated space, and airborne transmission makes sense. And that really helped to start to tip the consensus about how COVID spreads.
So it was a super spreader event, but not because people were careless. They actually were practicing social distancing. They were washing their hands. They were behaving as they had been advised to do by the health authorities. Is that right? You do a wonderful job describing this in the prologue.
Yeah, I interviewed a number of the singers, and they would talk about what it was like then. In March 2020, they knew that there was COVID, in Washington State, but it kind of seemed like, well, it's like the flu, and like nursing homes are taking special measures to protect people there, but we'll just keep going about our business while following CDC guidelines. And those guidelines did not include the possibility that you could spread COVID just with your breath. You didn't have to sneeze on anyone. You didn't have to wipe your nose and then wipe a doorknob. You could just sing, and you could kill other people.
It seems to me, Carl, that we haven't learned very many lessons from our experience with COVID, in that, everybody has sort of pretended it's in the rearview mirror. It's gone. We don't have to worry. No face masks. We don't have to worry about air quality. And yet, we keep reading about tuberculosis. We keep reading about measles. It started with a couple of cases, and then it was 100, and then it was 200, and then it was 500. And these are all airborne diseases. Why haven't we learned our lesson?
I do wonder why we haven't. I think this really was the first time in medical history where the scientific community and the public at large really reckoned with an airborne disease that could cause mass casualties. We just hadn't really experienced that before, that combination. I mean, we have been dealing with airborne diseases for millions of years, but this was the first time where you had a pandemic and it became clear that it was spreading through the air. And so I think it was a lot to handle. And it's a very, it's a very disruptive idea. I mean, how do you protect yourself against something where keeping your distance isn't enough? What do you do? And you're dealing with this invisible enemy. It really does require a lot of different ways of thinking about public health, and we're moving slowly, if at all, to that new way of thinking. Just in the same way that understanding that bacteria in contaminated water could be responsible for diseases like cholera and typhoid and so on. But once we came to accept that, then cholera epidemics in the United States went away. Typhoid is not a major problem in the United States because we came to recognize that. And then we came to expect that our public health authorities would make sure that our water is clean. So we're still waiting for that paradigm to shift with air.
And I'd like to ask about tuberculosis, which sounds like one of those diseases that, you would have worried about in the 19th century, possibly the early part of the 20th century. Actually, I'm old enough to remember that when my parents were in graduate school back in the 1950s, one of their colleagues, the wife of one of their colleagues, had tuberculosis, and she didn't have to be in the hospital. She was at home, but we kids would gather on the lawn in front of her living room window and perform tricks to entertain her because we couldn't go inside and talk to her. On the other hand, we've sort of started ignoring tuberculosis recently, except in other parts of the world. Is this something we should really be paying much more attention to?
Oh, absolutely. Tuberculosis is the biggest infectious disease killer on Earth. It kills over 1 million people every year, and still does, even though there are antibiotics that can kill it off. And with good healthcare systems, tuberculosis actually shouldn't be that bad at all. And yet, worldwide, it still, remains a huge burden, and it is exquisitely airborne. People used to think that, they thought, well, maybe people with a certain kind of, heredity were prone to develop tuberculosis. Then when the bacteria for tuberculosis were discovered, people thought, okay, it infects the lungs, and then people cough and then spit. They produce a lot of spit and they spit on the ground, and then it turns to dust. And if the dust gets stirred up, then that could give you tuberculosis. That's where all the no spitting laws came into existence at the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that just turns out to be wrong, that basically like someone who with tuberculosis can just be sitting quietly breathing and be releasing tiny droplets that have the bacteria in them. And then those bacteria can ride in those droplets, get inhaled and taken all the way to the furthest recesses of the lungs, and then they can start a new infection.
What surprises me, Carl Zimmer, is that when people did have tuberculosis, it was recognized that air quality was really important, and people went to sanitariums where they often were exposed to fresh air and sunlight. And yet many of our modern hospitals are really closed. You can't open the windows. The air circulation may be okay or not. We never know what the carbon dioxide levels are. They don't have CO2 monitors, so you can tell. And they may have good filters, but when we go to the supermarket or the pharmacy or a sporting event, we have no idea about air quality. And so I'm wondering why the infectious disease experts aren't paying more attention to the possibility of multi-antibiotic resistant TB that is spreading around the world. We may have to go back to some of those old ideas that were so popular in the 20th century.
It is true that there was a tradition of sending people to these sanitariums where they would get lots of fresh air, but the idea was somehow that that fresh air would somehow sort of dry out these wet lungs, and that's not that may or may not help, but that's not the fact that tuberculosis is airborne what that means is that is how the bacteria actually gets from one person to another. It's infectious that way. And indeed, when you would have these tuberculosis hospitals where people would just be kept for years, if they were in bedrooms without a lot of ventilation, they could infect other people. So doctors and nurses were regularly getting tuberculosis just by inhaling the air. It's a frustrating situation because in fact, when William and Mildred Wells demonstrated ultraviolet light could kill pathogens like tuberculosis, the bacteria that cause tuberculosis, some Veterans Administration hospitals did install ultraviolet lights in their tuberculosis wards. They saw that there was some merit to this. But
Was that helpful?
Based on what we know about tuberculosis, yes, that probably was helpful. There was no formal trial, unfortunately, to really test the effect versus a control arm. But from what we know now, it could very well have been helpful. Yes, unfortunately, there are some places where tuberculosis wards are protected with UV light or other measures, but yeah, too often the bacteria is clearly able to travel through the air and go from one person to the next. A quarter of all people on Earth have been infected with the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. It can slowly then develop into an active disease. But clearly, this bacteria is incredibly successful at getting around through the air.
You're listening to Carl Zimmer. He writes the Origins column for the New York Times. Carl Zimmer is an adjunct professor at Yale, where he teaches writing. He's the author of 14 books about science, including Life's Edge. His most recent book is Airborne: The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe.
It's time for a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about mold and mold spores. Do they travel through the air too, and how easily are they transmitted?
We'll also discuss how you might use a CO2 monitor to assess air quality.
During the pandemic, people got really excited about masks. Unfortunately, the issue of whether to mask or not and which masks to wear became politicized. What can Carl Zimmer tell us about masks based on his review of the research?
Other places, including both Japan and China, responded differently to the COVID pandemic. Did anybody get it right?
What places did better at controlling this airborne infection?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. You've surely heard about the microbiome, the collection of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that live on and in us. Even though your immediate association might be with the gut microbiome, every part of us has its own distinctive microbial collection, including the lungs. So maybe it won't be too shocking to think about where those lung microbes come from.
How would you know if the air you breathe is likely to be contaminated? Have you ever seen a carbon dioxide monitor in a supermarket, pharmacy, or doctor's office? CO2 is not dangerous in itself, but it is an indicator of how many people have been breathing into a confined space and how good the ventilation and filtration system really is. Is there anything public health authorities can do to improve air quality?
To learn more about the aerobiome around us and its health consequences, we are talking with Carl Zimmer. He writes the Origins column for the New York Times. He's also written for The Atlantic, National Geographic, and Scientific American, and won awards for his science journalism. He teaches writing as an adjunct professor at Yale University and is the author of 14 science books. His most recent is Airborne: The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe.
Carl, I'd like to fulfill a promise I made to our listeners, and that is to talk a little bit about mold and mold spores. Because there are some people who say, I am super sensitive to mold. And when I walk into a room or a house where there's mold, I can sense it immediately and I get pretty darn sick. And the medical profession has been a little, shall we say, resistant to that concept. Can you tell us a little bit? We've talked about viruses, we've talked a little bit about bacteria, but we haven't talked much about mold spores. What's the story?
So mold are a type of fungi. There are many different species of mold, and there are certain kinds of mold that like to grow in our houses, and if the conditions are right, a certain level of dampness or so on, they can get to be a real problem. And so, in some extreme cases, there's the mold grows in such abundance and produces lots of spores, that when they're inhaled, they can make people acutely sick. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether, to what extent mold might, trigger more kind of low level reactions, allergic reactions and so on. And, there it does become a challenge to really, to present really firm evidence like, yes, it's the mold that is giving you that particular experience. How part of the problem is that, the air inside of our houses is it's far from sterile. Like, there are lots of things floating around in your home, and there are lots of things that can potentially cause allergic reactions, asthma, so on and so forth. There are fungi, for example, that live symbiotically inside of mice, and can be released in their droppings, which then dry out and get released into the air. And it's been just recently discovered that there's some species that are incredibly abundant in mice, and the mice are fine with them, but when we inhale them, they can be harmful. So I would say that there are still a lot more questions and answers about the effects of airborne mold in our households. That being said, there are definitely strategies to deal with the air in our homes. Like I said before, ventilation, air purification, good filters. These are all good things, and to make sure that your home is not a place that really encourages the growth of a lot of certain kinds of living things like black mold.
So you can actually get a device that's not very expensive to measure the relative humidity in your home. It might even be combined with a thermometer that measures the temperature, gives you a min-max on that. We have such a device. And then it's a little harder to actually measure whether there's stuff floating around in your air. But in the prologue to Airborne, you describe attending an actual performance by the Skagit Valley Chorale after or towards the end of the pandemic, let us say, and you took with you a device that can measure how much people are breathing into the air around you. It's called a carbon dioxide monitor. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Sure. These devices that can measure the concentration of carbon dioxide have been around for actually quite a while. It's just that most of us really haven't been aware of them or thought of them as being important to our own health. But scientists have known, even from the 19th century, that the level of carbon dioxide is a good rough measure of your risk of getting airborne infection from someone in an indoor space. And the reason is simple. If you are in a room and all the windows are closed and the doors are shut and you don't have a ventilation system on and you just sit there and you breathe, you are going to inhale oxygen and you're going to exhale carbon dioxide. You're going to be gradually adding more carbon dioxide to the room. And if you have one of these carbon dioxide meters like I have, I mean, they're not that expensive and they fit in the palm of your hand. You can watch over the course of minutes the carbon dioxide level go up and up and up in the air around you. Now, if you are healthy, then that carbon dioxide level doesn't matter that much in terms of infection. But, if you're in a room with somebody who has measles or tuberculosis or COVID or a bunch of other airborne diseases, they're going to be building up in the room along with the carbon dioxide. So it's a good way, I find, to just sort of be mindful of the air around you and the potential risk it might pose.
Carl, one of the most contentious issues during COVID and even after the worst of the pandemic was over was masking. And people got into fights, and I think some people even died as a result of this controversial issue of wearing a mask, not wearing a mask. We were told by a lot of people masks are worse than nothing. They make it harder for you to breathe. And when I watch health personnel these days, they wear mostly surgical masks. And even surgeons, when they're performing surgery, are wearing surgical masks. And yet, what we learned during COVID was that surgical masks are actually not that great. They have gaps around the neck, around the cheeks, around the nose, and that the N95 masks that are actually, fitted more tightly to the face are the much more effective kinds of masks for filtering out viruses. Can you give us some sense of what you've learned about masking over the course of doing the research for airborne?
Yeah, the history of masks is fascinating. It's kind of wild to think that surgeons, even in the late 1800s, were going about cutting open patients with no mask on. And it really took a sort of a recognition that speaking or coughing or what have you could release germs from the mouth, from the airway, could then land in a patient and make them sick. And so we're accustomed to seeing surgeons with masks on. It would be weird if we didn't. But the question of how well masks can protect the public at large from a pandemic, that has been, as you say, a much more controversial subject. And I think part of it has to do with the psychology of masks. A lot of people don't, not only do they find them uncomfortable, but they feel like it's a sort of an imposition on them. That's certainly a phenomenon in the United States. If you go to Japan or Hong Kong, that's not really an issue at all. People sort of see it either as protecting their own health or protecting other people because they might be sick and might risk passing on to someone else. So there's a lot of cultural issues that go on with masks. But certainly, as you say, N95s, just on a basic physics perspective, can provide more protection than surgical masks. The question then is, do masks, when used, at scale, actually help with reducing transmission? And, certainly recent reviews, like, for example, from the Royal Society, find that wearing masks, particularly these high quality respirators supported by mask mandates, generally reduce the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. I know people don't like to hear that, but that is where these kinds of large scale studies are landing right now.
Carl, you mentioned other places, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, as well as the United States. Different places have different approaches, and we certainly saw that during the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about how China responded to this pandemic? And then I will ask if anybody did it right.
Well, for China, yeah, they took a very different approach than literally the rest of the world. China is where COVID began, and unfortunately, it got out of control before China could really start to try reining it in, and so then it was spreading around the world. But meanwhile, China under Xi Jinping was cracking down with lockdowns and other measures that were far more draconian than most other countries. And there you would see these stories about families who we basically like sort of sealed in their apartment because one member had tested positive. Children being separated from families. It was incredibly harsh, and it went on and on and on. Now they did reduce the rates quite successfully for a while, and Xi Jinping was boasting about it. But then the virus kept evolving, and Omicron emerged, and the fact is that Omicron, among other things, could evade the immunity, and also seems it might actually be more successful at spreading through the air. It's better at being airborne, and all of a sudden, COVID started spreading like crazy in China, and Xi Jinping decided like this was too much. The protests were getting too much to these lockdowns, and he just like let everything go. And it was kind of astonishing that like about 1 billion people probably got infected in the space of a month. I think that that's actually kind of an amazing, exceptional moment in medical history. I'm not sure that anything like that had ever happened before. I certainly don't see any record of that. And maybe 1 million people died. Maybe, we don't know. So they did hold off COVID for a long time, but eventually it was too much for them.
So I don't think anybody else is going to be wanting to adopt that Chinese model. Were there any places in the world that actually did a good job of addressing this, what turned out to be airborne infection?
Well, there certainly are, big differences in, the death rate from COVID. Compare the United States and Canada. Canada had a much lower death rate. South Korea, Japan, countries like that also did quite well. Part of it was just trying to reduce transmission as much as possible before people could get vaccinated, and then getting as many people vaccinated as possible. That seems to have been, really helpful. But also, the fact is that, the United States healthcare system itself is not in great shape. And so, how well a public health system could respond to a pandemic was another determining factor in whether people would live or die.
Carl, what about public buildings? You mentioned that we might have technologies that will analyze the air in our homes and alert us if somebody has walked in with some kind of nasty bug. But I keep thinking, well, what about pharmacies and doctors' offices and maybe supermarkets and sporting events? I mean, shouldn't we be monitoring all of these venues for the kinds of airborne diseases that could do real damage?
Well, it would certainly be a big help because, these spaces that you're talking about, these are places where lots of people come together. And if even one of them has a highly contagious disease, they can spread it in a super spreading event to a lot of other people. So it would be great if there could be real time sensing of airborne pathogens at these sorts of places. But that technology does not yet exist. It could exist in the next few years, and actually there have been government initiatives in the United States to just recently to push that forward. We'll see if they keep pushing that forward with support. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for those newer kind of sci-fi sensors, there are measures that we can already take to check the ventilation of spaces. Like, how often is the air in these public spaces being replaced with fresh air? There and scientists have been coming up with standards for that, like the rate of ventilation. If you can't ventilate a space very easily, like what kind of ultraviolet light should you use, and so on. These sorts of standards could be, enforced as mandates for public indoor spaces. They're not yet, but they could be.
Well, we have an old fashioned technology. You mentioned it already, carbon dioxide monitors. They're relatively easy to purchase, they're not that expensive. We could have a CO2 monitor in the supermarket, in the pharmacy, in the doctor's office, even in the hospital. And there could be a monitor, and you could look at that monitor before you walk in the door and say, oh my goodness,
I'd
this
better put on my mask.
or the CO2 level is 1200. I'm not going into this building. And all of a sudden, I think a lot of organizations would improve air quality immediately if a lot of people said, we're not coming into your building. Your CO2 levels are terrible. Your fresh air is just not adequate.
Yeah, well, no, I agree. I mean, I teach a writing class at Yale, and I went into the building where I was going to teach this fall, and it had just been renovated. So it was a new space for me. And I was delighted when I walked into my classroom to see that, the thermometer, the sort of thermostat, which showed me the temperature in the room, also had the carbon dioxide level. And I was very pleased to see that it stayed below 1,000, which meant that there was good ventilation in the space. So I felt pretty good.
Now, you said carbon monoxide, but you meant carbon dioxide, right?
Sorry. Yeah, I meant carbon dioxide. Yeah. Yes. The thing is, though, that having carbon dioxide readers in these public spaces certainly could help. However, that alone isn't going to solve the problem. I mean, if a restaurant has high levels of carbon dioxide, which shows that it's poorly ventilated, what do they then do? What are affordable solutions that restaurant owners can put into place to keep their customers healthy? That's an open question. But like we need to address it in the same way. Like if a restaurant has water that it's using for cooking that's contaminated with sewage, like you'd close the restaurant down. So we might want to think about the air in a similar way. Is the air that everyone's sharing, is it clean? Just like the water is clean.
Well, there's a price tag, as you point out. And I think for the most part, our public health authorities and our infectious disease experts have not wanted to advise the public or other officials that, yeah, we're going to have to pay not millions, but billions, maybe tens of billions of dollars to improve our air quality. And nobody really wants to tackle that problem.
The question of how expensive it's going to be to keep the air clean is a complicated one because, if you start having people using different kinds of technology at scale, that can put pressure to lower the cost because it's going to, stimulate, new ways of building these things and more, affordable ways of keeping air clean. And then on top of that, when you keep people healthy, you are saving lots of money. People will be having less sick days from airborne diseases, and they will be spending less time in the hospital and so on. Like there can be potentially huge overall savings, real economic savings, by keeping people healthier, by keeping the air clean.
You've talked about ventilation, you've talked about filtration. What are some other tactics for improving indoor air quality?
Yeah, well, it's really just a few key measures that I've seen really explored are ventilation, filters, air purifiers, and ultraviolet light. Those are the main ones that I have been seeing.
And
What kind of air purifier?
And tell us a little bit about the UV system. Are they safe? Are they affordable? Are people using them?
Some people are using ultraviolet light, and what's interesting in the whole history of this issue of airborne infection and airborne disease is that in the 1930s, right when William and Mildred Wells, did this pioneering work to really establish that diseases can spread through the air, they very quickly discovered that ultraviolet light could kill it. In other words, the ultraviolet rays passing through the air would shoot through these tiny droplets and disable viruses and bacteria when they hit them. And so when the Wellses were working at the University of Pennsylvania, they went into a couple schools in Philadelphia and they installed ultraviolet lamps in some of the classrooms. Now, they were pointing the lights upwards so that, if you stared at the lamp, you weren't going to blind yourself. And because of the circulation of the air, that these droplets that were carrying bacteria viruses would rise up to the ceiling, and there, if they passed over the lamp, they get knocked out. And in 1940, there was a big measles epidemic that hit Philadelphia. And the kids in the ultraviolet protected rooms had a 10 times lower chance of getting measles than other kids, even in the same school. And that was a really compelling demonstration that ultraviolet light can help. And it's kind of amazing. Like that was a long time ago, 85 years ago. And today there are people who are sort of trying to revive that and trying to come up with even more effective ways of using ultraviolet light. So there's a particular form of ultraviolet light called far UVC, which seems to be especially effective because you can actually point the lights down. That kind of light cannot penetrate the eye or the skin, but it seemed to be very effective against COVID and other pathogens. And so there are these far UVC lamps that are, they're not cheap, but they are available. And there's a lot of research going on those right now.
Carl, in Airborne, you mentioned that there may be some benefits to us to breathing in some of these living organisms. That sounds surprising. Can you tell us anything about that?
You obviously do not want to breathe in a coronavirus that's going to give you COVID. That's not a good thing. However, the fact is that, as we breathe in a couple thousand gallons of air every day, we inevitably are breathing in lots of living things. Some of those things actually will settle into our airway and just have a very happy, peaceful life. There are some species of fungi that seem to travel through the air and set up inside of us. And so that fact has actually led some scientists to think, well, maybe we've actually developed a kind of peace treaty, as it were, with a lot of the aerobiome. And in fact, maybe we're so accustomed to breathing in living things that, in some ways it's beneficial for us. It's possible that some species may stimulate our immune systems to mature and to be able to sort of avoid overreacting to things. There might be other benefits as well. And so some scientists have been looking into, well, what are the relative impacts of inhaling certain species versus others? They've done really interesting experiments with mice, inhaling dust from forests as opposed to from cities, and it has strange impacts on their mood even. There's just all sorts of fascinating, tantalizing research that's going on. And so some scientists are saying maybe we could actually garden the aerobiome. Maybe in cities we should be planting trees and other plants that can support a healthy diversity of microbes that will be good for us to inhale. They like to call this the probiotic city. And it's really going to be interesting to see where that research goes.
So, in summing up Airborne and why you wrote the book, and more to the point, what we may have learned from COVID about air quality, ventilation, filtration, you know, these pandemics aren't going to go away. We are going to have another one at some point. What should we have learned? What should we do going forward?
We should have learned that the air, in fact, is a route that pathogens can take to get us sick. There's no, and we have to take that in, and it's not just during a COVID pandemic. It's every day. And the disease might be measles, it might be tuberculosis, probably influenza is to some extent airborne. And then, you have other diseases that are probably traveling long distances, even hundreds, thousands of miles. There's a fungal disease called valley fever, which is becoming more of a problem, particularly in the Western United States, caused by fungal spores that can spread in the wind. We have to acknowledge that. And, we are going to face a pandemic in the future. It may well be some kind of virus that we haven't seen before. And if it is an airborne pandemic, that will make it all the more dangerous. There's a reason that, the American military and the Soviet military looked at airborne disease, looked at air biology and said, this is a great way to make biological weapons. The whole biological weapons program was built on aerobiology, on making airborne disease a weapon. But nature can make biological weapons too. And so we need to be ready for that. And we can be ready. I mean, there are existing technologies that work. And, if scientists get the support, they can develop better kinds of technology. We could potentially have sensors in our homes that would be sampling the air and actually sequencing bits of DNA or RNA and saying, hey, there is influenza floating around your house, things like that. Those would be a really big boon for controlling airborne infection. And we should be taking steps to be preparing for that next big attack.
Carl Zimmer, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Carl Zimmer, an award-winning science journalist. He writes the Origins column for the New York Times and is the author of the recently released book, Airborne, The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
Today's show is number 1433. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. That's where you can share your comments about today's interview. You can also reach us through email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
Our interviews are available through your favorite podcast provider. You'll find the podcast on our website on Monday morning. On this week's podcast, we speculate on why air quality in public buildings isn't being monitored. Inexpensive CO2 monitors could be used to evaluate air quality in such buildings.
It would be helpful to have such results posted prominently so you could decide whether or not to enter a confined space, but improving ventilation and increasing air exchange could be pricey.
Are there any more affordable tactics to improve indoor air quality? You'll learn about air purifiers and whether ultraviolet radiation is really effective. And you'll also hear about an odd concept, potential benefits of breathing in living organisms.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about important health stories. When you subscribe, you also have regular access to information about our weekly podcast, so you can find out ahead of time what topics we'll be covering. Speaking of the podcast, we'd be so grateful if you would consider writing a review of the People's Pharmacy and posting it to the podcast platform you prefer. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.